Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen. With us for our program today, Assemblyman Mark Johns. Mark Johns represents the 135th Assembly District in New York State, an Assembly District that includes Monroe County. We want to thank all you folks in the Rochester area for joining us for our show. And Assemblyman Johns, always nice to see you.
Always great to come back.
This is the opportunity here for you to let the folks that you represent back home know what kind of impact this recently concluded negotiations on the 2017-18 New York State budget, well, what does this all mean to those folks that you represent? Is this a good budget, a bad budget? Will they notice any of the...
Well, you may notice some things. This budget was a mixed blessing. I'm in my 7th year down here, and the first 6 years I was down here, we had on-time budgets. They were done by April 1st like they're supposed to be. And this most recent one was about a week late. So there's nothing to brag about for a budget being a week late. But compared to, days gone by when budgets were a month, 2, 3 months late, you remember that.
I sure do.
I think the year I got elected in 2010, the budget didn't come through until August 4th.
Yeah.
So, it's better than it was, but not as good as it should be.
Well, let's talk a little bit to start with this discussion about the process, because there was a lot of attention on it. The legislature was here around the clock for a couple of weeks.
Oh, yeah.
That didn't sit well with some people who wanted to get back home and see their family.
Well, the assembly, you know what? Maybe your family didn't want to see you. They tell you to stay down in Albany, But
I suppose depends upon who we're talking about.
Outside of that, we did take a 2-week vacation, or otherwise known as a tax-related holiday, to stay down here. But unfortunately, the dysfunction in Albany had us staying down here and doing nothing. And that's really the worst. It's nothing to brag about that the budget was late, but to stay down here and cause the taxpayers tax dollars to go for per diems and other things while we're basically spinning our wheels, that's not good. And ultimately, it's still 3 men in a room or 4 men in a room that decide the budget. Then it's trotted out the next day with message of necessity, because as you know, budgets or any legislative item is supposed to age for 3 days so we can all read it and study it. And the only way of getting around that is for the governor to issue a message of necessity, which means you can vote on it right away. It's not the optimal way of doing a budget or any kind of legislation.
In Washington, the federal government's going through some budget work of their own right now, and there's talk of a government shutdown and all that.
Right.
Now, that was avoided here in Albany because the legislature passed what's known as extender legislation, just keeping government up and running as the negotiations continued. I thought this was interesting, you used the opportunity of the vote coming up in the Assembly to issue that extender. You used that opportunity to kind of put in a good word for an idea that you've got that would hopefully maybe change the process for the better here at the state capitol.
Right. Well, I do believe that we should do biannual budgets, do a 2-year budget, and then should this type of fiasco happen again, it will only happen once every 2 years.
Let's take a look at what you said on the floor that day when the extender legislation came up, because I think you explained it pretty well right there. And then we'll come back and we'll talk more today with Mark Johns.
Mr. Speaker, I was elected in 2010. I'm in my 7th season. The first 6 years we had on-time budgets that were done by April 1st or sooner. We've got a 3-day delay now, going on a 2-month delay. And I was elected in 2010 to come down here and talk about reform in Albany. And I have a suggestion for all my colleagues here. Happen to have a bill. Now, this is not self-serving, Mr. Speaker, but I happen to have a bill for a 2-year budget cycle. And we could do a lot with a 2-year budget cycle. In 2 years, we would only have to come down here in the first year, pass a 2-year budget. If it needed adjustments, we could do it in the following year. But the first 3 months of every year, we're down here doing budget items. If we did a 2-year budget cycle in the second year, we'd only have to be here 3 months just to do the legislative part. That would save tens of millions of dollars in per diems, mileage, throughway tolls, and all the government entities, including school districts and everything else, would know exactly what they're going to get going 2 years forward. I think that would be a great idea. We're talking about a vote this year on the Constitutional Convention. It's going to be a vote up on the back of your ballot this November 7th. If we don't start issuing and ushering in real reform down here in Albany, I believe that people are going to vote for a Constitutional Convention to try and rectify some of the things that we're going through right now. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
One of the things I like about what you say there is remembering why you came to Albany in the first place those years ago, and then that was to change things up and talk about reform. Albany tends to be a pretty reactive place, and people will forget a couple of years later that it was not all that long ago we were looking at the convictions of the Assembly Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader and talking about the corruption that's inherent in the institutions of the state legislature. And not really a lot's been done about any of that, or this budget process that has been a year-to-year kind of what's going to happen now.
Yeah, well, the budget is part of it, but the governor's talked about ethics reform, and you see all the good government groups talking about ethics reform and other reforms. And a 2-year budget cycle is just another reform that ought to be enacted so that we can be a little more functional down in Albany. The reality is we're down here for 6 months a year. That's why it's a part-time job. But during that 6 months, like I said, the first 3 months is based, we do things based on the budget, and the second 3 months is legislative. If we had a 2-year budget cycle, we'd only have to come down here in the second year, and we'd save millions of dollars in per diems by coming down in the second year and only doing legislation. And the school districts and everybody else, the municipalities back home, they're going to know how much money they're going to get 2 years in advance. It's going to help them plan their budgets.
Yeah, there was a time here during these negotiations where the governor seemed to say, if it's not on time, it's not going to be that big a deal, which struck me as kind of odd because it was so important to him the first few years to have the budget on time. But the school districts are prepping right now to get their budgets proposed so that when voters who approve the school budgets go to the ballots in May, they know what they're voting on.
Right. Well, May 16th is the budget, school budget votes. And on Tuesday, May 16th, obviously, well before that, they have to have all their figures done in advance so the voters can go to the polls. There's nothing worse than holding up how much money is going to come in. Now, fortunately, we added $1 billion into the school budget aid this year. But the fact is, who knows what's going to be coming next year? I think the schools would kind of like to know, as well as other municipalities, cities, towns, villages. They'd all like to know where they're going to be standing next year.
What do businesses tell you that a successful business is going to have like a 5-year budget, right? Where they have something proposed out there to be planning.
Oh, yeah.
And know what's in front of them.
Now, and people say, well, what if you have to make adjustments? Well, there's no problem. The governor's already said that if Washington does anything, untoward towards New York State and make some budget cuts or whatever, the governor said he's ready to do the adjustments. So we already have budgets that have to be adjusted. That's just a fact of life. If we come back here and take a few days to adjust a budget we did the previous year, that's not a problem.
All right. Now, on this particular spending plan now that is in place, the process has played out. Again, what do you say to your folks back home about is this a good thing for them or not?
Well, it's a mixed blessing. Yeah. The property tax cap is still on.
That's a good thing.
It is. The governor's pushing for consolidation. Of course, I say that, this is a little off the topic, but I say we ought to consolidate up here. We get rid of 2/3 of the career politicians up here, we'd save $150 million a year minimum. Think about that. We could have a unicameral legislator have just the Senate only. We don't need to have bills pass 100 to 50. We could have the bills pass 50 to 25, and we would save a lot of money. People want term limits. They want ethics reform. They want a lot of things that I think if you fix the system, the dysfunctionality that's plugged into the process, we can actually come up with better laws and better budgets. And, not to be long-winded about this, but the budget is going up about $2 to $3 billion a year. What I tell people, especially people that work for the state or the counties or in the pension system, there is no money down here. We're borrowing this money. And when we spend at least $2 billion a year extra, and we're not bringing in $2 billion a year extra in income taxes or in sales taxes, where's that money coming from? And they do what's known as backdoor borrowing. You get different, different
authorities.
Authorities, right? Yeah. I mean, what does the dormitory authority have to do with borrowing money for the state? And the reality is, we say in the state constitution, to borrow money, you have to go to a referendum of the voters. 95% of the debt in this state has never been approved by the voters. Right. And as you go into debt, I always tell people, especially people that worry about a future pension, there's only one pot of gold down here. And if they have to raid the pension fund because we're looking at bankruptcy, that's not going to be good for the workers that work for New York State, the schools, the counties, whatever.
Yeah, the state has been borrowing quite a lot for a long time. And when I challenge the people watching this program to remember the last time you went to the polls and voted on a bond act of any kind.
Yeah.
It seems that there's been an end run or a workaround done on how to do that kind of funding. One of the things I wanted to ask you about today, there had been some concerns that workers known as direct care workers who supply some of the basic services to developmentally disabled or to seniors, that they were kind of left in short shrift, and minimum wage is going up right and left for different sectors of the workforce, but not the direct care workers. And because of that, people were stopping their interaction in the direct care industry, providing that care, to go get jobs flipping hamburgers or in some of these other places, because they can make more money doing that than providing direct care.
Right, and direct care for people with, elderly people, people with disabilities, direct care is a very tough job. And if minimum wage is going to $15 an hour for fast food workers and the other things you're talking about, we needed to make sure that direct care workers were paid that much plus more. And the Assembly minority, led by Brian Kolb and the rest of us, made it an issue to be fair to direct care, to make sure that they got at least as much or more than, you mentioned hamburger flippers would get. It's a much tougher job, and we like to have stability in that area.
There was even a rally called Be Fair to Direct Care.
Right.
Mark Johns spoke very briefly at that. Let's take a look at what he said.
I just want to sum it up with this one phrase. Fast food workers do important work, but the work you do is critical. And we thank you all for doing it. Thank you.
That's positive and upbeat. You had an opportunity to, there was a lot of people there from the direct care workers that were at the Capitol that day. And they were pleased to get that kind of support.
Right. We got something like $45 million in this year's budget going to OPWDD and direct care components for people to be able to go out there and do this critical work. Anybody that has a family member that's disabled in some way knows direct care is tough, but it also has to have the proper amount of pay or no one's going to want to do the job.
And anybody who's got a family member or a loved one receiving that kind of care, they'll be the first to tell you how important it is to have quality people that you can count on, people that you can knows their stuff, doing that kind of work.
You like to have stability in that line of work because they know the patients, they know the people who are living in the environment that they're living in, they understand the background, and they're better able to help out when they have long-term employment.
We're out of time already. We just scratched the surface here. Maybe we can come back and talk about some of the other parts of this budget, some of the policy stuff that was worked in. But Mark Johns, we're done. I appreciate you being here today.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, I thank you folks too for stopping by and making us part of your day. We'll hope to see you all soon for our next edition of Assembly Calendar.